Hello, and welcome back to biology. Today, I want to talk about homeostasis, and there's actually going to be two conversations about this. The first one is this one, and it's about thermoregulation. And we'll talk about what that means in just a second. But first, we're going to get everything started with a question, if the slide will change. Hello. There we go. All right, so which function of the human blood includes the other three? Transporting nutrients, transporting oxygen, collecting waste, or maintaining homeostasis? Well, we know that blood is important for transporting nutrients and oxygen, and we know that blood is filtered through the kidneys so you can remove metabolic waste and things like that. But all of these three things are involved in maintaining homeostasis. So, 4 is the answer. So, homeostasis is internal stability within an organism and the ability to return to a stable state after any sort of disturbance, okay? And so systems are going to function in a way that is integrated with each other to maintain this constant internal environment. It's going to be around some set point. There's going to be a range of tolerance that is acceptable. Outside of the range of tolerance is not acceptable, okay? But the goal is to keep everything as close to that optimal point as possible, okay? So changes, right, to the internal environment are going to have to be regulated, right? And you're going to have changes because you've got all sorts of metabolic activities, right? Because you've got to bring in oxygen, you've got to bring in nutrients, right? Those have to constantly be coming in. Those waste products that I was talking about before have to be expelled, right? Excreted is actually what they're going to end up doing in our conversation later on. And then you've got all sorts of special times during an organism's life. That may be during the reproductive cycles. It may be during sexual maturity, right? The actual arriving at sexual maturity, development, right? And then, of course, external things. We respond to what are called challenges from the environment, okay? Now, to maintain homeostasis, there are feedback loops, right? And a feedback loop has really 3 parts, right? There's a receptor, and this is the thing that's going to detect the change, right? Then there is a control center, and this is what processes the information. And then there's the effector, and that is what is going to bring about that return to normal, okay? Now, there are some feedback loops that don't actually have the control center portion of it that processes information. Those are direct feedback loops. We're not actually going to talk about those. But anyway, and then these get more complicated. That's the simplest, right, where you just have the receptor and then an effector. Then you have the receptor, control center, effector, and then you've got some that are even more complex. But we're going to just kind of keep it simple. All right, so in this question, I have a diagram for you. And you have some stimulus, right, some change, and then you have Q, R, S, and P, right, and here's your response. So what the question is asking is, what are each of these letters, right? So is P the feedback, right? Q, receptor, R, controller, S, effector. Is P the receptor, right? So you see how this works? So take a look at that for just a second and then decide which one you think this is. Okay, so I hope I've given you enough time to think about it. But when you have a stimulus, it's going to be received, right? So Q is the receptor, right? Okay, so we've got A, C, and D could be the answer. Then, of course, it has to be processed, so you have the controller integrator. That is this. Then there's the effector that's going to give us a response, and that is going to bring us back, right? This is our feedback, to normal, okay? And so there's the P represents the feedback loop. So the answer is A. See how the system works? Okay, now there are actually 2 types of feedback loops. There are the ones that are like inherently regulatory. Wow, that was crazy to talk. Those are the negative ones. What that means is that the system has gone out of balance, right? It's imbalanced, and then the feedback loop brings it back to normal. And so you have a response. The effector is going to be in the opposite direction. A positive feedback loop is in fact non-regulatory at all because it will reinforce some sort of change. And we'll talk about that. Those are not really as common as negative because the positive ones are going to keep pushing you more and more out of this homeostasis, right? These optimal ranges. But let's start with a negative feedback system. I have here the regulation of blood sugar. This is a very well-known feedback system. So basically what happens is you're trying to maintain homeostasis, okay? So let's say your blood sugar level, glucose, right? Your blood glucose levels rise. That is going to trigger your pancreas to secrete insulin, okay? And then you're going to have that's going to result in an increased rate of glucose transport, right, into cells. You're going to have an increased rate of glucose utilization, right, and you're going to be able to make lots of ATP, which is very exciting. And then you're going to have this conversion of glucose to glycogen. And glycogen is a storage molecule for glucose, and so it locks it up so it's not affecting the system doing these two things. You're also going to have an increased amino acid absorption and protein synthesis, right, because you've got more ATP and you've got all of these other things that are going on. And then you have an increased fat synthesis because you are storing, again, all of these potential energy molecules, okay, which is what sugar, glucose is. Now, as you do all of these things, that's going to actually cause the concentration of glucose in the blood to go down, right? And so you're going to restore homeostasis. Now, there's another mechanism that if this gets too low, it'll actually kick it back up. And so if we were to draw this, we could actually draw a whole nother loop going down to bring the levels back up to homeostasis. Okay. That we're going to talk about it several negative feedback loops, by the way. That's just the first one. There are lots and lots and lots of them. But positive feedback loops, these are really unstable and they are short-lived. It's when you need some sort of really big change, okay? They're limited because if they continue on, things start to fail and that's bad, right? And they're very stressful to the body, okay? And there are three examples that I want to give you. Mammalian birth, right? And that's the one that we'll talk about in just a second. The generation of a nerve impulse. And so while there are not that many positive feedback loops that we could list, every time you have some sort of nerve impulse, that is actually a positive feedback loop. And when we talk about the nervous system, we're actually going to talk about that particular feedback loop. So that's going to come, hang on, that'll be later. All right, and then swallowing or vomiting. And we are not actually going to talk about that, but it is. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about childbirth, though, because we've been talking about sexual selection and fertilization and parenting and all that good stuff. So let's talk about what actually happens when you have a mammal being born. So first of all, you have the fetus is big, right? And so there's pressure on the uterine wall. And so nerves will carry that message to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to produce and release oxytocin into the blood. So oxytocin is a hormone. This is also the hormone that stimulates milk production, okay? And then it is going to increase the strength of the contractions. So when the uterus contracts, right, which is intensifying, it's going to also intensify that pressure of the fetus on the uterine wall. And this is going to continue on until there is no pressure on the uterine wall, and that means the baby is out, okay? But you could imagine that if this goes on and on and on, it would be a real problem. So let's talk about the harmful effects. Here's a really good example, okay? A fever can cause a positive feedback loop that will continually push the temperature higher and higher and higher. And so this is why high fevers are really dangerous, because they actually cause proteins, right, to denature, which means that those proteins come apart, and then of course you don't have all of the good things that you need, right, that proteins do. Building blocks, hormones, right, all of these messengers, things like that, and all of the other things that we've talked about that proteins do, okay? So this is why you have to bring high fevers down. All right, so let's move on to the big areas of homeostasis. You have thermoregulation, which is what we're talking about today. You have excretion and osmoregulation. So excretion is waste removal, and osmoregulation is solute balance and water balance. Okay, and osmo really here is referring to water, but you're going to be balancing ions and water at the same time, and that'll be the subject of next time. So thermal regulation is exactly what it sounds like. It's maintaining an internal temperature, because getting back to that fever situation, you can't have a temperature that's too high, but also you can't have a temperature that's too low, because processes cease functioning. And if things freeze, cells actually rupture, and that's super bad. All right, so this is going to involve anatomy, physiology, and behavior. And so this is a really complex, lots of strategies kind of situation. Okay, so here's your first question. Why don't reptiles inhabit extremely cold regions on Earth? They lay eggs in water and they would freeze in the cold. They're ectotherms, they are endotherms, or they have moist skin that would freeze in the cold. Well, 1 and 4 are right out, because we know that reptiles, right, have that great leathery eggshell that allows them to lay eggs away from water, and we know that reptiles are actually not slimy, right? That would be amphibians. Endotherms, ectotherms. What does that mean? Well, it turns out that reptiles are ectotherms, and ectotherms mean that they rely on the external environment for temperature regulation. Endotherms mean that they are going to regulate their temperature internally. Now, each of these, of course, has benefits and disadvantages, right? Advantages, disadvantages. So the great thing about being an ectotherm is that it's a low energy requirement. However, it really limits where you can live, because you have to be in a place that is going to allow you to maintain a good temperature, which is why you do not find reptiles in cold places, right? Really cold places. Now, endotherms, the downside to being an endotherm, while you can live anywhere, and that's great, is that it requires lots and lots and lots of energy to actually be an endotherm, okay? And then, of course, there's benefits and costs. Okay, and then most vertebrates actually have a combination of endothermy and ectothermy. Now, if they are more ectotherms, they're considered ectotherms. If they have more endothermy, they're considered endotherms, but there is going to be a little bit. Now, some animals actually are true heterotherms, sharks, for instance, and some other things, but we're not really going to talk about those. But a true heterotherm has pretty much an equal mix of both, okay? But here's some examples. Behavioral thermoregulation in mammals is actually an ectotherm strategy, and these contractions that snakes use is actually an endotherm strategy, okay? And then the true heterotherms are the thermal core, and again, we're not talking about that. Okay, so let's talk about thermoregulation in endotherms. So first of all, your body temperature is going to increase above a set point. That is going to activate your cooling mechanism, okay? So your brain is going to talk to your thyroid, right? In both of these cases, actually, and your hypothalamus is also going to be involved in this. So basically, your brain here is going to process less metabolic heat, okay? Of course, if your body temperature decreases, it's going to be more metabolic heat. But over here, we're going to start over here. So what's going to happen is your voluntary nervous system, you're going to seek shade and slow your activity. This is behavioral. But your involuntary nervous system is going to trigger sweating, and your blood vessels are going to vasodilate, right? Which means they're going to expand. There's going to be more blood at the surface of your skin to radiate the heat off to help you cool, okay? Now, hopefully, this will all work and you will cool down to your really good temperature. Now, if you get too cold, okay, same thing, same kind of system over here, then your voluntary nervous system is going to cause you to seek shelter, go hang out in the sun, right, do all sorts of things. Again, this is going to be behavioral. And then your involuntary nervous system is going to trigger shivering, right, so that generates heat. You're going to have vasoconstriction this time because that's going to keep blood away from the surface to reduce heat loss, okay? And so these, by the way, are going to be your autonomic nervous system. And again, we'll talk about the nervous system later on in the course. Okay, so heat exchange with the environment. Let's start with ectotherms, right? Because remember, they're dependent on this heat exchange. So there are really 4 big strategies. There's radiation, there's evaporation, conduction, and convection. And radiation is where you have heat is either being directly it's, sorry, not directly transferred. So it's a transfer of heat. So like the sun falling on the lizard here, right? That's going to be radiation because it's going to absorb the heat radiating from the sun. By the same token, you can cool off by radiating heat outwards, okay? Evaporation is where you have a liquid, water, that's on the surface. As that evaporates, it's a cooling process, okay? Convection is where you have air or liquid, so liquid would be in the case of aquatic animals. So you have this liquid moving past, okay? Breeze, by the way, you move that warm air that's radiating off of the lizard itself. It'll move it away, okay, and that's what convection is. And then conduction is where you have a direct transfer. So you'll see lizards and things like that, snakes, lizard snakes, all these reptiles, laying on hot rocks, okay, and that is because that is a conduction, it's a direct transfer. All right, so there are 5 big categories of adaptations for thermoregulation. That's insulation, circulation, evaporative cooling, behavioral response, and then adjusting metabolic heat production. Some of these work for endotherms, some of these work for ectotherms, and some of them work for both. So here's your first question on this. Hair helps mammals by providing camouflage and helping them to maintain evolution, running speed, body temperature, or reproduction. Well, only one of those makes sense. Only one of those actually makes sense in our lecture, but only one of those makes sense in general, and that would be body temperature. Hair has nothing to do with any of the other things there, okay? It is a product of evolution, though. All right, so insulation. Hair is a type of insulation. This is the major thermoregulatory adaptation in mammals and birds, okay? And the great thing is that it reduces the flow of heat between an animal and its environment, so there's a lack of exchange, okay? This is great in colder climates. You obviously would not want this in hot climates. That would be bad. All of these features of insulation arise from the integumentary system, right? That's your skin. So feathers, fur, blubber, adipose tissue, all of these things are going to be part of that integumentary system, okay? Now, the other great thing about this insulation is that it protects you from injury, it acts as a barrier to infection, and it keeps in water, which is the subject of our next homeostasis conversation. Now, it has to also, though, provide a balance between heating and cooling, because you don't want to keep in too much heat because you'll get too hot, and of course you can't let too much out. Circulation, we've already talked a little bit about that. We talked about regulating body temperature feedback loop. Vasoconstriction is that lack of exchange. Vasodilation allows for heat to radiate off of the body, okay? And that works for both ectotherms, endotherms. Now, evaporative cooling, this is where you have the heat loss through evaporation, which is what we talked about again in those 4 big types of heat exchange. Bathing, right? You get wet, the water evaporates off of you. Sweating or panting, okay? That is also going to have that great kind of evaporation thing. Obviously, sweating is going to be more overall, whereas panting is just in the mouth. So the mouth of dogs, for instance, this is a dog's mouth, is going to be highly vascularized. So you've got lots of blood that flows through that area, okay? And then gular fluttering by birds is very similar to panting. Now, there's a huge problem with this, and that is water loss. So obviously, you're not going to be doing a lot of sweating if you live in the desert, where you at least you don't want to. Okay. Now, behavioral responses, there are lots of these. I'm just going to highlight a couple. Avoidance, okay? Move. There are various kinds of things. I'm going to let you read this later on, but basically, get out of the hot or cold, okay? Changing your orientation, right? Minimizing or maximizing your exposure to the sun, right? That's what we're talking about here, getting into the sun, yeah? Migration, if it is too cold, move. If it's too hot, move, yeah? Torpor and estivation, these are where you can actually slow down processes. Torpor is for cold, okay, and so it's like an adaptive hypothermia in such a way, but it's not damaging. Like when we think of hypothermia, we think, oh, the next thing's death. But basically what happens is fat stores from the animals eating during the day are not going to be enough to get through the cold night, and so they basically slow everything down. Estivation is the opposite of that, right? It's when it's really, really hot. You do the same thing. You don't have enough food, right, to make sure that you're running these processes, and so you slow down, okay? And then, of course, hibernation. This is another cold response. This is deep torpor. It just means that it lasts a very long time, and the animals survive off of their brown fat in terms of keeping warm and stuff like that. And then thermogenesis, back to that fat situation. Fat turns out to be very important because you've got, this is your energy storage, as we've talked about before. Now, first, though, I want to talk about shivering, because there are really two types of thermogenesis, which is an endotherm way of generating heat. This is that metabolic heat production. So shivering is just the contraction of the muscles. It generates heat, okay? You're not actually moving, right? You're just having this brief contraction that gives you that shaking, well, shivering, because that's what it's called. Okay, and then the other one is when you're metabolizing fat. Okay, now white adipose tissue, there's white fat and brown fat. Okay, white fat is going to be used for metabolism just all over the body, but brown fat, actually, and this is what you're going to find in your big old, blubbery animals, is lots and lots of brown fat. This is what's metabolized for the rapid release of heat. Okay. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about really quickly is the biochemical thermoregulation, which I think is really cool. And what I'm talking about in this case are antifreeze proteins, right? So you put antifreeze in your car to keep those liquids fluid. You do that. There are animals that have evolved glycoproteins and polypeptides that actually act to prevent ice from forming. There are lots of different types of these. They have arisen in different groups independently, in lots of groups, okay? There are fish that have them, plants that have them, insects that have them, and bacteria, sea ice bacteria, that have them too. And so really, really cool stuff. And then this is just a table I've put in here so you can kind of get an idea of who's doing what and where. And then the last thing I want to talk about are some interesting structural trends. So we were talking back about the anatomy. So we've got Bergman's rule that is going to talk about size, right? You have bigger bodies in colder climates. Obviously, a larger body has a smaller surface area to volume ratio than a smaller body, and so you can maintain heat structure, heat structure is not a thing. You can maintain heat, and then here's a white-tailed deer skull. You can see Michigan deer, where it's very cold, are really big, and Nicaraguan white-tailed deer, really small. And then, of course, you have your tropical bears. That's a spectacled bear right there. No. That's a spectacle bear. And then you move up to, or maybe that's an Asian sun bear. It doesn't matter. These are tropical bears, and that, of course, is a polar bear, which is your largest land carnivore. Now, Allen's rule talks about having shorter appendages, because remember, a high surface area to volume ratio means, right, that you've got a lot of surface area, and a lot of surface area means a lot of exposure, so you can radiate heat better, okay, or you can have convection, and that's very exciting. You would not want that if you were, say, Arctic. And so look at this, right? You have these giant ears in this little fox. I'm pretty sure that's a kit fox, but I'm not sure. This, I do know, is an Arctic fox, right? And you can see tiny, tiny ears. And when you look at these rabbits, right, snowshoe hare, really short ears, really short limbs. Jackrabbit, which we actually have here in Texas, long limbs, long ears. Okay, so that is it for this conversation, and thanks for listening. I will see you next time.